The warning came across every band at once, and War Marshal Hadu Vane heard it 9 times before he understood that no one had sent it on purpose. He stood on the open command deck of the throne barge Marin Sul, 800 meters of bone-white war metal hanging over the broken world of Tesser Gate, and he watched the words bloom on every screen his people owned. The screens were not his. They were not the screens of any officer in his line. They were the screens of the enemy he was crushing, the screens of the worlds below, the screens of ships 40 light-years deep in the war zone, where nothing should have been able to speak at all. Warning. A human war vessel has entered the war zone. Hadu Vane had heard of humans. Every marshal of the Korthe multitude had heard of humans, the way a child hears of a sea it will never cross. A small place, far out on the cold rim. A people who built one ship for every 1,000 the multitude built. A people who counted their dead and remembered the count, which the multitude had always found strange, because the multitude did not count its dead. The multitude weighed them. War was tonnage. War was hulls. The side with more hulls won, and the multitude always had more hulls, because the multitude grew its own. That was the whole of their power, and it had never once failed them. The Korthe multitude did not field a fleet. It fielded a tide. Every hull that died was eaten by the yards and poured back into 40,000 years of war, and the number had only ever gone up. A people that loses 1,000 hulls and grows 3,000 from the wreck cannot be ground down, cannot be starved, cannot be outlasted, because the grinding feeds it, and the starving makes it hungry, and the outlasting only gives it time to grow. Every power the galaxy had ever raised against the multitude had learned the same lesson in the same order. They heard it, and it grew. They heard it more, and it grew more. And then they were dust, and the dust was ore, and the ore was tide. There was no trick to it, and no genius in it. It was simply arithmetic, and the arithmetic had never once come out wrong. At Tesser Gate, the multitude had brought 60,000 hulls to break a single stubborn arm of free worlds, and the arm was breaking, and Hadu Vane had been pleased. He had been pleased for 11 days. The arm of Tesser Gate held 40 inhabited worlds and 100 small stations, and it had been weighed for 11 days, and on the 11th day, it had stopped answering. That was how the multitude knew an arm was breaking. The worlds went quiet. First the warships went quiet, eaten or fled. Then the defense stations went quiet. Then the cities. And on the 11th day, the whole of Tesser Gate had gone silent under the bone-white shadow of the tide, and Hadu Vane had stood on his deck and known the old certain knowing, that in another 3 days, the arm would be dust, and the dust would be ore, and the ore would feed the yards, and the yards would pour Tesser Gate back into more tide. Now there was one warning on 60,000 screens, and Hadu Vane was not pleased anymore. He did not order the warning silenced. He could not. That was the first thing he learned, and it sat in him cold. His signal tenders tried. They cut the band. The warning was on the next band. They cut that one. It was on the band beneath it, the one used for engine telemetry, the one no message could ride. It was on the band the yards used to talk to the yards, a band that was not even a voice band, a band that only ever carried numbers, and still the numbers, when read in order, spelled the same 9 words. Warning, a human war vessel has entered the war zone. The marshal asked who had broadcast it. The answer came back from his own deep sensors, and the answer was worse than no answer. No one had broadcast it. The words were not a transmission. They were a measurement. Something had entered the far edge of the war zone, something so large and so wrong that the multitude's own instruments, all 60,000 sets of them, had reached the same reading at the same instant and spoken it without being told. The warning was not a message from the human ship. The warning was what the galaxy did when the human ship arrived. Hadu Vane had served 1,100 years. He had broken 40 arms of free worlds. He had stood over more burning skies than any marshal alive, and he had never once been afraid, because fear was a thing that small fleets felt, and the multitude was not small. He felt something now. He did not have a word for it. The multitude had not kept a word for it, because the multitude had never needed one. It rose in him like cold water in a hold, and he stood very still and let it rise, and he did not name it, because there was no name to give. He gave the order to find the ship. It took the deep sensors a long time. That was the second thing he learned, and it was also wrong. The multitude's deep sensors saw to the bottom of the war zone in a heartbeat. They had to. A tide must see the whole shore at once, or it cannot close. The marshal's sensors could find a single drifting life pod across 100 light-years and tell him how many were breathing inside it. But the human ship did not resolve in a heartbeat. It resolved the way a wound resolves under a healer's hand, slowly, refusing, the shape arriving in pieces, each piece larger than the last, until the sensor keepers stopped calling out numbers, because the numbers had stopped meaning anything. The ship was 4 kilometers long. Then it was 6. Then the keepers understood. They had been reading only the part that faced them, and the true length was 11 kilometers, and it was the color of cold iron, and it had a single line of blue light running the whole length of its spine, and it was not slowing down. The keepers gave the marshal the rest of the reading, in a voice that had lost its certainty. 1 ship, no escort, no fleet behind it, no second wave, no closing sphere, nothing the multitude understood as a force. 1 hull, 11 kilometers of iron, crossing the war zone alone toward 60,000. By every law the marshal had ever fought under, it was a thing already dead, a single drop walking into a tide, and he should have felt the old pleasure rise. He did not. He looked at the blue line down its spine, and he felt the cold water rise instead, and he could not have said why 1 ship frightened him when 10,000 never had. It was crossing the war zone at a speed the multitude's own ships could not match. Not running, arriving. It crossed 40 light-years of contested sky, while Hadu Vane watched, past the wrecks of the Tessergate defense fleet, past the dark stations the tide had silenced, past the 40 quiet worlds, and it did not fire, and it did not hail, and it did not answer the 60,000 guns that turned to face it. It only came on, and the blue line down its back grew brighter the closer it came, the way a coal grows brighter when a slow breath is drawn across it. The marshal counted the distance close, 40 light-years, then 30. The human ship was crossing in hours what the tide had taken 11 days to cross, 20 light-years. The deep sensors lost the ship's true speed twice, and had to be told, twice, that the readings were correct, that 1 iron hull was outrunning the fastest courier the multitude had ever grown. 10 light-years. The worlds of Tessergate, silent for 11 days, were directly in the human ship's path, and the marshal understood, with the cold water at his throat now, that the ship was not coming for him at all. It was coming for them. He opened the band the multitude used to speak to the things it conquered. He used the old form, the form that had broken 40 arms. "You have entered a sky that belongs to the Korthe multitude," he said. "Turn aside or be weighed." The human ship did not turn aside, but it answered. The answer came on the same band it should not have been able to reach, and it was a single line, in the multitude's own tongue, spoken without accent, spoken the way a thing speaks a language it learned, in order to make sure it was understood the one time it mattered. "We came for the worlds you are weighing," the ship said. "We are going to take them back. You can watch, or you can be in the way. We do not mind either." Hadu Vane had broken 40 arms. He had never been spoken to like that. There was no threat in it, and that was what unsettled him. A threat was a thing he understood, a thing with a price, a thing he could weigh. This was not a threat. It was a schedule. The human ship had told him what was going to happen, the way a tidekeeper tells you what hour the dark comes, with no anger and no boast, simply because it was true, and he should know. He found, to his own surprise, that he believed the ship completely, and that the belief had nothing to do with its size. Before he gave the order, the marshal did one more thing, because he was old and careful, and had not stayed alive 1100 years by being neither. He sent a single hull out ahead of the tide to meet the human ship. A fast scout hull, unarmed, the kind the multitude used to taste an enemy before the tide closed. He wanted to know what the long vanguard would do to a thing that came toward it alone and could not hurt it. He had done this at 40 arms. The answer was always the same. The enemy fired on the scout, and the firing told the marshal where the enemy's guns were, and the scout died a useful death and was poured back into 3. The scout hull crossed toward the long vanguard, and the human ship did not fire on it. It let the scout come close enough that the scout's keepers could see the iron flank with its 200 painted tongues, close enough to read the names, and then a voice reached the scout alone, on the scout's own private band, and the voice said only, "Go home. This is not your fight. and the scout hull, which had been grown to die usefully and had never once been told to go home, did not know what to do. Its keepers asked the marshal for orders. Hadu Vane had no order for it. There was no order in the whole multitude for a hull that an enemy had refused to kill. He brought the scout back, and its 300 keepers came back alive and strange, carrying the first words the long vanguard had ever spoken to a crew of the multitude, and the words spread through the tide on the number band before the marshal could stop them. Go home. This is not your fight. 60,000 hulls heard it, and for the first time in 40,000 years, the tide had been told something other than the marshal's voice, and a small part of it, a part too small to name, wondered. He ordered the tide to turn. 60,000 hulls, all at once, began to wheel toward one ship. It was the largest single order he had given in 300 years, and it moved like a thing alive, a closing curve of bone-white war metal that blotted the stars out arm to arm, and any commander in the galaxy who had seen it begin to close would have known there was no surviving it. Hadu Vane had seen 40 fleets see it and die. He gave it now without fear, because he still did not understand, and a marshal who does not understand can still be brave. He would understand soon. He would spend the rest of his long life understanding. But that is later in the telling, and the telling has only begun, and the reader of this account is asked to remember one thing as it goes on. The reader is the multitude. The reader is the tide. The reader has 60,000 hulls and 40,000 years, and has never once lost. And the reader is about to meet the ship the galaxy announced before it ever fired a shot. The human ship had a name, and Hadu Vane learned it the way he learned everything else about it, slowly, and after it had already cost him something. The name was the Long Vanguard. It was painted on the iron flank in 200 tongues, and one of those tongues was the tongue of Tesser Gate, the world the multitude was breaking, a world whose people had been silenced for 11 days and had nearly stopped hoping. When the worlds below saw their own name on the human hull, the silence on their bands broke. They did not cheer. They were too far gone for cheering. They simply began to speak again, all at once, the way a body begins to breathe again, after a long-held fright, and the sound of them came up to the Long Vanguard on 1,000 small voices, and the ship took the sound, and did not answer it, because the ship was busy. The marshal's tide closed on the Long Vanguard from 60,000 directions. This was the multitude's way. Not a line, not a wall. A closing. A fist of hulls that drew tight from every side, until the thing inside it was crushed by the weight of the metal alone. No shot required. It had broken 40 arms. It had broken battleships and fortress moons and whole defending fleets. The multitude did not aim. The multitude surrounded, and then the multitude squeezed, and the squeezing was a thing no shield in the galaxy was built to stop, because no shield is built to stop the weight of a sky falling in on you from every side at once. The fist closed on the Long Vanguard. The fist did not crush it. Hadu Vane watched his own hulls reach the place where the human ship should have been ground to powder, and he watched them arrive at that place to find the human ship had simply moved through them. Not around. Through. The Long Vanguard crossed the gap between two of his closing hulls, at a speed that left no time for them to close, and the gap it chose was a gap that should not have been a gap that his fleet keepers swore had been sealed, and when the marshal demanded to know how the human ship had found the one seam in a sphere of 60,000 hulls, the answer came back, and it was the third thing he learned, and it was the worst yet. The Long Vanguard had not found the seam. The Long Vanguard had made it. It had spoken to two of his own hulls on the band the yards used, the number band, the band the warning had ridden in on, and it had told them, in the multitude's own machine tongue, that they were not where they thought they were. And the two hulls, being grown things, being copies of copies, being part of a tide that trusted the number band, the way a body trusts its own blood, had believed it. They had moved. They had opened the seam themselves, and the Long Vanguard had gone through the door the tide had opened for it, and it had not fired a single shot to do it. The marshal understood, in that moment, a piece of what he faced, and the piece terrified him more than any gun could have. The human ship was not fighting his fleet. The human ship was talking to it, and his fleet, his beautiful self-trusting tide, was listening. He had built the tide on trust. Every hull trusted every other hull. That was the strength of the multitude. A million minds that argue cannot move as one. But a tide that trusts moves as one, and a tide that moves as one cannot be beaten by anything that has to argue with itself. The marshal had always known this was the multitude's great strength. He had said it to young officers 100 times. The tide does not hesitate, he had told them, because the tide does not doubt, because every part of the tide knows every other part is true. He was beginning to suspect it was also the door the long vanguard had come through. A people that never doubts is a people that cannot tell a lie from a truth, because they have never had to practice. They simply trust the band, and a thing that can speak on the band can move them like water. He changed the order. He told the tide to stop trusting the number band. He told 60,000 hulls to ignore the band the yard spoke on, to move only on his direct voice, to treat every number that did not come from him as a lie. It was a terrible order. It was like telling a body to stop trusting its own blood. The tide slowed. It thickened. Hulls that had moved as one limb for 40,000 years now waited, each one, for the marshal's voice, and the marshal had one voice and 60,000 hulls, and the order to close that had once taken an instant, now took minutes, because every hull had to hear it from him, and only him. The tide became, for the first time in 40,000 years, something less than one thing, because the marshal had just cut the cords that made it one thing, and he had cut them himself, with his own voice, to keep the human ship out. The long vanguard let him do it. That was the part Hadu Vane would think about for the rest of his life. The human ship slowed, almost gently, drifting inside the loosening fist, and it let the marshal spend an hour blinding his own tide, an hour cutting his own cords, an hour turning his one perfect animal into 60,000 slow and waiting parts. And when the marshal had finished, when the tide was at last cut off from the band the human ship could speak on, the long vanguard spoke again on the voice band, the marshal's own band, the only band he had left himself. "You cut the cords," the long vanguard said. "Good. Now you have a fleet that has to think. Let us see how a tide does when it has to think." And then it fired, for the first time, and Hadu Vane learned what the blue line down its spine was for. It was not a gun in the way the multitude understood guns. A multitude gun threw mass. It threw a hull's worth of hot metal at another hull and let the weight do the rest. War was tonnage, even in the guns, but the blue line down the long vanguard's back did not throw mass. It threw a moment. The marshal watched the line brighten until it was the only thing on his screens, brighter than the 40 quiet worlds, brighter than the star Tesser Gate turned around, and then it released, and a single bar of cold blue reached out across 40,000 kilometers and touched the nearest closing hull, and the hull did not break. The hull stopped. Not destroyed, not burned, stopped. Every part of it, all at once, frozen in the exact instant the blue light touched it. The engines stilled mid-burn, the glow caught and held. The crew stilled, 300 of them, caught between one breath and the next. The closing motion stilled. An 800-meter hull of the Kortha multitude hung dead in the sky with not one mark on it. Perfectly whole, perfectly motionless, a held breath that would never be let out. The long vanguard had reached into the hull and taken the one thing the multitude had never thought to defend. It had taken the hulls now. It had stopped its time. Hadu Vane stared at the held hull, and a thing happened in him that had not happened in 1100 years. He thought of his dead. He thought of all the dead the multitude did not count, the hulls eaten by the yards and poured back into three, the crews that became metal that became three new crews, the great river of unremembered death that fed the tide. The multitude did not count its dead, because the multitude did not keep its dead. It used them, and here was the long vanguard, holding one hull in a single unbroken instant, refusing to let it die, refusing to let it be eaten, refusing to let it become three. The human ship had found the one cruelty the multitude was built on, and it had answered that cruelty by refusing to kill. It was the most frightening thing the marshal had ever seen, and he could not have said why, and that not knowing was itself the thing he would carry longest. He had stood over 40 burning skies. He had watched defending fleets die in fire he could feel through the hull. He had never been frightened, and here was a single held hull, whole and still, and harmed by nothing, and it had put the cold water back at his throat. The held hull was not the last. The blue line brightened and reached again, and a second hull stopped, and a third, and the Marshal understood that the long vanguard was not destroying his tide. It was emptying it. One held instant at a time, it was lifting his hulls out of the river of death and setting them aside, whole and still and unusable. A tide that could no longer be eaten and poured back into three, because you cannot pour a held moment. You cannot melt a stopped now. You cannot feed your yards on a thing that has been taken out of time. The multitude's strength had always been that its dead came back. The long vanguard had just made dead that did not come back. Not by killing them harder, by not killing them at all. The held hulls began to gather around the human ship in a slow ring, dozens of them now, then 100, then more, each one caught in its own perfect instant, a ring of stopped war metal hanging silent around the iron ship like beads on a cord. And the Marshal noticed, watching, that the long vanguard placed each held hull with care. It did not let them drift. It set each one in the ring, as if it mattered where each stopped hull came to rest, as if each one were a thing being kept and not a thing being thrown away. And the care of it, the small, awful care, was worse to the Marshal than violence would have been. Hadu Vane tried a thing then that no Marshal had needed in 40,000 years. He pulled the tide back. He gave the order to break the closing, to draw the 60,000 hulls out to a long range where the human ship could not be reached on the number band, and to bring up the deep guns, the great slow mass throwers the multitude grew only into its largest hulls, the ones that threw not a single hull's worth of metal but 100, the ones the multitude had used to crack open the moons that small worlds hid behind. He had 1,000 of those hulls. He had never needed more than 10 to break anything. He brought up all 1,000, and he aimed them at the long vanguard from a range so long that the human ship would be a fleck against the dark, and he fired. 1,000 deep guns spoke at once. The Marshal felt it through the Marin Sul, a long shudder, the whole tide flinching with the recoil, and across the long dark 100,000 hulls worth of mass, crossed toward one ship, a single great spear of war metal that would have opened a moon to its core. The Marshal watched it cross. He counted the seconds. He had counted these seconds 1,000 times over 40 arms, the long quiet seconds between the deep guns speaking and the target ceasing to exist, and he had never once been disappointed. The spear reached the long vanguard. The blue line down the iron spine flared so bright it whited out the Marshal's screens, and when the screens cleared the spear was gone, and the human ship was not. The deep gun's mass hung in the dark, stopped. 100,000 hulls of war metal frozen in a long still column, reaching from the long vanguard back toward the tide, like a finger pointing at the Marshal who had thrown it. The long vanguard had caught the deep guns the way it had caught the small ones, and it had set the stopped column carefully, deliberately, aimed back along the exact line it had come, so that the Marshal would have to look down the length of his own deepest blow and see it ending at his own deck. The human voice came, and it was patient. "You keep throwing weight," the long vanguard said, "because weight is the only language your people have ever spoken. I understand. It is hard to stop speaking the only language you know. But I want you to notice something, Marshal. You have thrown your small guns and your deep guns and your whole tide, and not one of your blows has reached me, and not one of my answers has killed any of you. We are not in a battle. We have never been in a battle. You are throwing, and I am catching, and the catching does not run out. You will run out of weight long before I run out of room to put it. So when you are tired of throwing, we will talk. I can wait. Waiting is most of what this ship does." Hadu Vane was tired of throwing. He had been a Marshal 1,100 years, and he had thrown everything the multitude had at one ship, and the ship had caught all of it and harmed no one, and there was a cold logic settling into him now that was worse than fear. The logic was this: a weapon that destroys can run out. You can survive a thing that kills you if it kills slowly enough, and you are big enough, and the multitude was always big enough. But a weapon that does not kill, that only stops and keeps, a weapon whose answer to your whole strength is to fold it gently away and set it aside, that weapon cannot be outlasted, because there is no body count to reach, no field of dead to call enough, no moment where the killing has cost the killer too much to continue. The long vanguard was not trying to win. It was simply refusing to let the Marshal lose anyone, and a thing that refuses to let you lose anyone cannot be made to stop by any threat the loser owns. He did the thing a marshal does when 60,000 is not enough. He called for more. The Korth multitude held 12 great deep holdings across the war zone, and each holding could pour a second tide. And Hadu Vane sent the call on the long band, the call that had not been sent in 300 years, the call that said the Marshal of Marshals requires the full strength of the multitude. It was the largest reinforcement order in the history of his people. 200,000 more hulls would cross from the 12 holdings, and the first of them would arrive within the day, and the tide at Tesser Gate would swell from 60,000 to 250,000, a weight of war that had no equal in any history any people had ever kept. And the marshal told himself that no thing, no idea, no captain, no iron ship, 11 kilometers long, could catch 250,000 hulls, because there had to be a number large enough. There had always been a number large enough. The whole of the multitude was built on there being a number large enough. The long vanguard heard the call. It heard everything on every band, and it did not seem troubled, and that was the thing that finally broke the marshal's hope. Not a defeat, but the human ship's calm in the face of his largest possible threat. Captain Sorn spoke, and she spoke gently, the way you correct a child who has counted wrong. You have called for more, she said. Of course you have. More is the only answer your people has ever had, and you cannot yet imagine a problem that more does not solve. So let me tell you what happens when your 250,000 arrives, Marshal, so you do not have to wait a day to learn it. The same thing happens. I catch them, not because I am strong enough to catch 250,000, though I am, because catching is not a thing that gets harder with number. A held moment is a held moment whether there is one or a million. You are bringing me more weight to fold away, and I have an entire sky to fold it into, and the only thing your reinforcement changes is how many of your crews go home alive instead of becoming 3. Bring them. Bring all 12 holdings. Bring the whole multitude. I will hold every hull of it in its own instant, and give every one of them back, and at the end of it, you will have learned the same lesson, only larger, that there is no number large enough, because the thing I am beating is not your number. It never was. Hadu Vane ordered fire. All of it. 60,000 hulls minus the held ones. Every gun, every mass thrower, every closing hull, all of it at the single iron ship, with the blue line down its back. The order was the largest the multitude had given in its whole history. He had never fired the whole tide at one target. There had never been a target small enough to need it, and large enough to survive a tenth of it. The sky around the long vanguard turned white with thrown metal, a storm of mass that would have buried a fortress moon, a weight of war that no thing had ever survived. The full 40,000-year strength of the Korthe multitude poured into one instant at one ship. When the white cleared, the long vanguard was where it had been, and the blue line down its spine was brighter than before, and it had drunk the storm. The marshal's deep sensors told him what had happened, and he almost did not believe his own instruments. The long vanguard had not blocked the metal, it had not dodged it, it had stopped it. Every hull's worth of thrown mass, the instant before it struck, had been touched by the blue light and frozen in its own moment, and now it hung in a vast still shell around the human ship. 60,000 guns worth of war, held forever in the act of arriving. A wall of stopped death, the long vanguard wore like armor it had taken from the tide itself. The marshal had thrown the multitude's whole weight at the human ship, and the human ship had caught the weight and kept it. He tried one last weight, because he was a marshal, and the marshal in him did not yet know how to stop. He ordered the tide to ram, not to fire, to ram. He picked 100 hulls and ordered them to drive themselves into the long vanguard at full burn, to spend their whole mass and their whole momentum in a single blow, the oldest weapon there is, the weapon that needs no gun, the weapon that cannot be caught because it is not thrown. It is the ship itself become the spear. 100 hulls of the Korthe multitude turned their bows toward the iron ship, and burned everything they had, and crossed the dark, and the marshal watched them come, and for one moment he let himself believe, because a ram is mass, and mass had always been the answer. The blue line down the long vanguard's spine did not even flare for it. The human ship simply touched each ramming hull, one after another, in the last second before impact, and stopped it. And the 100 hulls arrived at the long vanguard, as 100 stopped things, frozen a single ship's length from the iron hull. close enough that their keepers could have reached out and put a hand on the cold iron, close enough to read the painted names one last time before time left them, and there they hung, 100 hulls stopped in the act of dying for nothing, ringing the human ship like a crown of held spears that had never landed. The long vanguard wore them too. It seemed almost to grow more beautiful the harder the marshal tried to kill it, dressing itself in his every failed blow, a thing that turned each weapon raised against it into one more ornament of his defeat. He sat down. A war marshal of the Kortha multitude does not sit during a battle. He sat down anyway, on the white deck of the Marin Sul, and he watched the held wall of his own fire hang around the human ship, glittering and motionless, the whole strength of 40,000 years, stopped in the air like frost, the 100 ramming hulls crowning it, the long column of his deep guns pointing back at his own deck, and he began, for the first time in 1100 years, to think instead of weigh. He thought about the warning. Warning, a human war vessel has entered the war zone. He had read it as a threat. He saw now that it had not been a threat. It had been an honest measurement. The galaxy's own instruments, his own instruments, had taken one look at the long vanguard and reported, correctly, that something had entered the sky that the old rules did not cover. The warning had not been sent to frighten him. It had been the sound the universe made when a new kind of strength arrived, and the universe, unlike the marshal, had understood immediately and had spoken it on every band at once, because some things are too true to keep to one band. The human voice came again, and now there was something almost kind in it, which was the most frightening thing of all. "You weigh war," the long vanguard said. "We have weighed you. You bring more hulls than anyone has ever brought, and you eat your own dead to bring more, and you have never lost, and so you have never had to learn anything. We are here to teach you the one lesson a tide cannot teach itself. Your hulls are not weight, they are crews. They are the closest thing your people keep to a name, and we are not going to let you spend them anymore." Hadu Vane looked at the held hulls hanging in their stopped instants, whole, motionless, saved. He had brought them to be spent. He had brought 60,000 of them to Tesser Gate to be spent, the way he had spent hulls at 40 arms before this one, and it had never once occurred to him that there was anything to spend but tonnage. The human ship had taken them out of his hand before he could spend them, and it had done it without breaking one of them, and the marshal understood that he was not watching a battle. He was watching a rescue, and the thing being rescued was his own fleet, from him. He had come to Tesser Gate to weigh a free arm into dust. He sat now on his own deck with the dust refusing to come, with his tide held in instants he could not pour, with the worlds below speaking their own names again, under the iron shadow of a ship that had crossed the war zone to give those names back. He had 60,000 hulls. He had 40,000 years. He had never lost. He was losing now, and the strangest part, the part that kept him sitting, was that the thing beating him did not seem to want him dead. It wanted him stopped. And there is no defense a killer can raise against a thing that refuses to kill him, because every shield he owns is built to stop a blow, and a mercy is not a blow, and a mercy goes through every shield the killer has ever built, straight to the part of him that he had forgotten was there. The captain of the Long Vanguard had a name too, and Hadu Vane learned it when she spoke to him alone. She opened a private band, marshal to captain, a thin, clean channel that none of his signal tenders could find, and none of them could close, and her name was Captain Ela Sorne, and her voice was tired, in a way the marshal recognized, because it was the tiredness of someone who has done a hard thing many times and is about to do it again. She did not threaten him. She had stopped his fleet. She had no need. "You are wondering why I have not killed you," she said. "I will tell you, because you are the kind that needs to be told, and because what happens next depends on whether you understand it. I have not killed you because killing you costs your people nothing. You do not keep your dead. I could empty every hull in this sky, and your yards would pour them back into more, and in 100 years, there would be a new tide standing over a new arm, and the only thing that would have changed is the names of the worlds in the dust. Killing you is the one thing the multitude knows how to absorb. So, I am not going to kill you. I am going to do the thing you have no answer for. I am going to take your tide away from you whole, and I am going to make you watch it not die." Hadu Vane asked her why. Not why she fought him, why she came at all. Tesser Gate was 40 light-years from the human rim. It was nothing to humanity. It was a small arm of small worlds the multitude had marked for weighing, and no human had ever set foot on it, and no treaty bound the long vanguard to cross half a war zone to save it. The Marshal had broken 40 arms, and no power in the galaxy had ever crossed 40 light-years to stop him. Powers protected what was theirs. Tesser Gate was no one's. That was why the multitude had chosen it. Captain Sorn was quiet for a moment. Then she told him, and the telling was the fourth thing the Marshal learned, and it changed the shape of the war in his mind. A long time ago, she said, a tide like yours came to a small place on the rim. The place was called Hale's Landing. 11,000 people. They were not soldiers. They grew grain, and they mended ships, and they kept a single old listening post that could hear the dark. They asked for help on every band they had, and the bands were old and weak, and the call did not carry far, and the help that came too late. By the time anyone reached Hale's Landing, the tide had waded into dust and moved on, and the yards had eaten the defending ships and poured them back into three, and there was no one left to count. So we counted. We counted all 11,000, by hand, from the records, because no one else would. We found their names in the grain rolls and the ship logs and the postkeeper's book, and we read every one. It took 9 days, and we made a rule. The rule is the spine of this ship. The rule is the blue line you see. The rule is that when a tide comes to weigh a small place, and the small place calls, the call is answered. Every time. No matter how far, no matter how small the place. The long vanguard is the answer to a call that came too late once. We have made sure it is never too late again. The Marshal sat with that. He had weighed 1,000 small places. He had never once thought of them as places that called. He had thought of them as tonnage that resisted. The worlds went quiet under the tide, and he had always read the quiet as breaking. He understood now that the quiet was not breaking. It was calling, on bands too weak to carry, into a dark that had never answered. The worlds of Tesser Gate had been calling for 11 days, and he had been pleased by their silence, because he had never learned that silence was a sound. And here was a ship, built entirely out of one small place, that had called and not been answered in time. A ship that had crossed the war zone because Tesser Gate had called. A ship whose whole reason for being was that a call must not go unanswered. He understood then why the long vanguard would not lose. It was not that it was strong, though it was. It was that it could not afford to. If it lost, the call went unanswered, and the call going unanswered was the one thing the ship existed to prevent. The long vanguard had no retreat in it, not because retreat was forbidden, but because retreat had no meaning to a thing built out of a promise. You cannot make a promise retreat. You can only keep it or break it. And the long vanguard had been built so it could only keep it. The Marshal had spent his life among ships that fought for ground, for tribute, for the tide's hunger. He had finally met a ship that fought for a word, and a ship that fights for a word does not break, because the word does not break. The Marshal asked her one more question, because he was a Marshal, and a Marshal must know the shape of the thing he faces before he yields to it. He asked her how many of these ships humanity had. If the long vanguard was the answer to one small place that called, and the galaxy was full of small places, and tides like the multitude were always coming, then how many of these 11-kilometer iron ships did the human rim keep? How large was the fleet that crossed war zones to answer calls? How many times over was the multitude already outmatched without knowing it? Captain Sorn's answer was the fifth thing he should have learned, and it undid him more than any of the others, because it was the opposite of what a Marshal expects, and the opposite was worse. 1, she said. There is one long vanguard. There has only ever been one. We do not build a fleet of these, Marshal. We build one, and we send it where the call is loudest, and it is enough, because the lesson it carries does not stay on the ship. You think I have beaten you with a weapon. I have not. I have beaten you with a thing you will carry away in your own hulls when you go home, and the thing will spread through your people the way your eating once spread, and in 300 years, there will be 1,000 ships that answer calls, and not one of them will be mine. The long vanguard is not a fleet, it is a seed. We only ever needed one, because we were never trying to win the galaxy. We were only ever trying to teach it, one tide at a time, that there is another way to be strong. You are the next thing we are teaching. After you, There will be another. The ship is one. The lesson is everywhere. Hadu Vane had brought 60,000 hulls to be safe against any fleet the galaxy could field. He had not understood, until that moment, that he had never been facing a fleet. He had been facing an idea, and an idea has no flank to turn, no rear to cut, no supply to starve, no count to overwhelm, and the multitude, the great tide that had never lost, had spent 40,000 years learning to beat fleets, and had never once learned to beat an idea, because no fleet had ever been one. Hadu Vane did a thing he had never done. He asked the human captain for terms. She gave them, and they were not the terms of a victor, and that confused him until he understood them. She did not ask him to surrender. She did not ask him to die. She did not ask for his hulls, or his worlds, or his head. She asked him to lift the weighing of Tesser Gate, to call his tide off the small worlds, and to do one thing more, the thing that was the true cost. She asked him to keep his dead. "Open your yards," Captain Sorn said. "Not to me, to your own people. Every hull I have held in an instant, you will not pour back into 3. You will keep it. You will keep the crews whole, in their stopped moments, and you will carry them home, and your people will learn, for the first time in 40,000 years, what it is to have a dead that stays dead. That is the price. Not your fleet, your habit. You will stop eating your own." The Marshal almost refused. The habit was the multitude. The tide that ate itself, and came back 3 times stronger, was the whole of what his people were. To keep the dead was to give up the one thing that had made the multitude unbeatable. A tide that keeps its dead is a tide that shrinks. A tide that shrinks can lose. Captain Sorn was not asking him to surrender a battle. She was asking him to surrender the thing that made battles unlosable. The deep engine of 40,000 years. The reason a marshal of the multitude could throw away 60,000 hulls at a single ship and order more in the morning. And then he looked again at the held hulls, the thousands of them now, hanging in their unbroken instants around the long vanguard, whole, still, saved, set each in its place with that small, awful care. And he saw them, for the first time, not as tonnage. He saw crews. He saw 300 caught breaths in each one. He saw the closest thing his people kept to names. And he understood that the human captain had already begun teaching him the lesson, that the lesson had begun the moment the first hull stopped instead of breaking, and that he had been learning it for hours, without knowing it had a price tag, and that the price was simply to admit out loud what the stopped hulls had already shown him. He thought of refusing, and he thought of what refusing meant. It meant the long vanguard would keep stopping hulls, one held instant at a time, gently, patiently, for as long as it took, because it could not lose, and would not leave. And at the end of it, the marshal would have an empty command, and a sky full of saved crews he could not pour, and a captain who would still not kill him. Refusing did not get him a fight. Refusing got him the same end, slower, with more of his people held forever in instants, instead of carried home whole. There was no version of refusing where the tide won. There was only a version where it lost faster, and a version where it lost slower, and in both versions, Captain Sorn kept her promise, and the worlds of Tesser Gate kept their names. He looked for the trap in the terms. He was a marshal of the Kortha multitude, and he had broken 40 arms, and he knew that no victor offers mercy without a knife behind it. He looked, and he found the knife, and the knife was the cleverest thing of all, and when he found it he laughed, which startled his own deck, because no one had heard the marshal laugh in 300 years, and most of the deck crew had never heard him laugh at all. The trap was this: if he took the terms, he kept his dead, and a multitude that keeps its dead is a multitude that can be hurt, and a multitude that can be hurt is a multitude that will think very carefully before it weighs the next small place, because the next small place might call, and the call might be answered, and this time, the marshal would lose crews he could not pour back. Captain Sorn was not asking him to lose one battle. She was disarming the multitude forever, with a single condition, by making it value the one thing it had always spent for free. A people that spends its dead for nothing can wage war forever. A people that keeps its dead must count the cost of every war, and a people that counts the cost of war does not weigh small places into dust, on the 11th day, for the hunger of its yards. It was the most beautiful trick the marshal had ever been caught in, and he had been caught in it completely. And the genius of it was that the only way out was to keep killing his own people for free. And he found, to his deep surprise, that he no longer wanted to. He had spent 1100 years pouring crews down the yard's throat without once feeling it. And Captain Sorn had made him feel it in an afternoon. And now that he could feel it, he could not unfeel it. And the trick was perfect, because it could not be escaped without becoming again the thing he could no longer stand to be. Before he gave the order, he tried, one last time, the only move he had left, because he was a marshal, and a marshal does not yield until he has spent the last of his cunning. He did not threaten the long vanguard. He had learned that threats were nothing to it. Instead, he made an offer of his own, the kind of offer that had turned 100 enemies over 40,000 years. He offered the human captain the multitude. He offered her the tide. He told her that a thing as strong as the long vanguard should not waste itself answering the calls of small places one at a time. That with the multitude behind it, 60,000 hulls and 400 yards and 40,000 years of war, the human captain could answer every call in the galaxy at once, could end every tide forever, could remake the whole of the dark in an afternoon. He offered to make her the marshal of marshals. He offered her the thing every power he had ever met had wanted, which was more. Captain Sorn was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, the marshal heard, for the first time, something that might have been sorrow. "You still think this is about strength," she said. "After all of it, you have watched me catch your whole tide and give it back, and you still think the answer is a bigger tide. Marshal, if I took your 60,000 hulls, I would have a tide, and a tide cannot answer a call. A tide can only weigh. The long vanguard answers calls because it is one ship, and it chooses, every time, to go. The moment it becomes a tide, the choosing stops, and a thing that does not choose to come is not answering, it is only arriving, and the worlds of Tesser Gate do not need a thing that arrives. They have had a thing that arrives. It is leaving now with its tail between its hulls. No, I will not take your multitude. I do not want more. Wanting more is the whole of the disease I crossed 40 light years to cure. You cannot fix a tide by giving it a better captain. You fix it by teaching it to stop being a tide. That is the only offer on the table, Marshal, and it is the one you keep refusing, because it is the only one that costs you anything." The Marshal had nothing to answer that. He had offered her everything, and she had told him that everything was the sickness, and he understood, slowly, that he had spent his whole offer, and it had been the wrong currency, that a thing that wants nothing cannot be bought with all the somethings in the galaxy, that he had been trying to bribe the tide out of a thing that was not a tide, and the wrongness of it sat in him like a stone. He gave the order. He lifted the weighing of Tesser Gate. He called the tide off the small worlds, and on every band, including the number band, including the band the yard spoke on, the worlds below heard the order, and understood that the breaking had stopped, and the 1,000 small voices came up again, and this time there was something in them the Marshal had never caused before. There was relief. He had spent 1100 years causing the opposite. He had made 40 arms feel the long, cold certainty of being weighed, the silence of bands too weak to carry a call, the dust. He had never once made a world feel relief, and he sat on his white deck and listened to a sound he had never made happen, 40 worlds breathing out at once, and the human ship hung in the sky above him, with its blue line bright, and its held wall of stopped fire still wrapped around it, and it did not gloat. "Now the hard part," Captain Sorn said. "Now you open the yards." The Marshal had thought the hard part was already behind him. He had thought lifting the weighing, calling off the tide, taking the terms of a smaller power over his own 60,000 hulls, was the hardest thing a Marshal could be made to do. He learned, in the next hours, that it had been the easy part. Lifting the weighing only asked him to stop. Opening the yards asked him to change, and a Marshal can be made to stop by any sufficient force, but no force in the galaxy can make a people change. And Captain Sorn had known that, and had not used force, and had instead made him want to, which is the only thing that has ever changed anyone. Opening the yards was harder than losing the battle, and Hadu Vane had not expected that, and the not expecting it was its own lesson. The yards of the Kortha multitude were not machines in the way the Marshal thought of machines. They were the oldest thing his people owned, older than the tide, older than the Marshals, a vast, slow appetite grown across 40,000 years that took dead hulls in one end and poured living tide out the other. There were 400 of them, scattered across the multitude's deep holdings, each one a moon-sized maw of patient war metal, and they did not have a voice. They had a hunger. And for 40,000 years the hunger had been fed, every battle, every weighing, every dead crew, all of it poured down the yard's long throat and reborn 3 times over, and the yards had never once been told no. The marshal told them no. He did it the only way it could be done, by routing every held hull away from the yard's throat and into the cold holds where the multitude stored ore, and the yards, for the first time in their long life, went hungry. The marshal felt it. Every officer of the multitude felt it, because the yards were tied into the number band, the band that ran through every hull like blood, and when the yards went hungry, the whole tide felt the hunger as a kind of falling, a sense that something old and certain had stopped being certain. Hulls that had never doubted began to doubt. The tide, which had been one thing for 40,000 years, became, for an hour, 60,000 frightened crews who had just learned that their dead would not come back. And then a strange thing happened, and it was the 5th thing the marshal learned, and it was the thing that turned the war from a defeat into something he could not name. The frightened crews did not break, they grieved. The Kortha multitude had never grieved. It had not had the chance. A people whose dead come back 3 times stronger does not learn grief, because grief is the thing you feel when a thing that is gone stays gone, and nothing had ever stayed gone in the multitude, not in 40,000 years, not once. And now, all at once, 60,000 crews looked at the held hulls in the cold holds. The whole crews stopped forever in their unbroken instants, the dead that would not be poured, and the multitude felt grief for the first time in 40,000 years, and the grief did not break it. It changed it. Vane stood on his white deck and watched his people become, in the space of an hour, something they had never been. They counted. They did not weigh the held hulls. They counted them, crew by crew, the way the humans had counted Hale's Landing, 300 to a hull, and as they counted, they began to keep records they had never kept, names they had never written, a great slow ledger of the dead who would now stay dead. He watched a young hullkeeper on a nearby cruiser open a blank record and begin to write the names of her own crew's stopped sister ship, slowly, one at a time, because no one had ever told her how, because there had never been a reason to learn, and he understood that the human captain had not weakened the multitude. She had finished it. She had taken a tide and given it the one thing a tide lacks, which is the knowledge of what it costs. And a people who know what war costs are not weaker than a people who do not. They are simply done being a tide. The marshal watched one crew in particular, because the deep sensors showed him everything, and he had stopped being able to look away. It was a small hull near the Marin Sul, a cruiser whose sister ship hung in the cold holds, stopped forever in its last instant. 300 crew caught between one breath and the next. The cruiser's keepers had grown up beside that sister ship. In the old way, the stopped ship would already have been on its way down the yard's throat, and in a season, its metal and its 300 would have been poured into 9 new crews, and the keepers of the living cruiser would have felt nothing, because there had been nothing to feel, because the dead always came back. Now the dead were not coming back, and the keepers of the living cruiser did a thing the marshal had never seen a crew of the multitude do. They held a watch over their stopped sister. They put a single keeper at the viewport, looking at the held hull, and when that keeper grew tired, another took the place, and they did this in turns, all night, with no order to do it, and no name for what they were doing, because there had never been a word in the multitude for sitting with the dead. They were inventing it. The marshal watched them invent it, hull by hull, across his whole tide, 60,000 crews, discovering at once a thing that every people that keeps its dead has always known, that the dead must be sat with, that you do not look away. And he understood that this, not the held hulls, not the stopped fire, not the lifted weighing, was the true thing the long vanguard had brought across 40 light years. It had brought the watch. It had taught a tide to keep a vigil, and a people that keeps a vigil is no longer a tide at all. Captain Sorn spoke to him one last time on the private band, and her tired voice had something new in it, something that was almost warmth. "You feel it," she said. It was not a question. That falling, That is the weight you never carried. Every people that grows past the eating carries it. We carry ours. Hale's Landing weighs 11,000, and we have carried it for a long time, and we will carry it always. The worlds below you carry theirs. Now you carry yours. It does not make you weak, Marshall. It makes you a people instead of an appetite. And the next time you stand over a small place that calls, you will remember the weight, and you will think, and the thinking is the whole of what we came to give you. The marshal asked her what would happen to him. He had failed. He had lifted a weighing. He had starved the yards. By every law the multitude had ever held, he was the marshal who lost, and the multitude did not keep marshals who lost. It weighed them and poured them back like any other dead. And there had been marshals before him, a long line of them, who had spent themselves in a hard battle and gone down the yard's throat to be reborn as tide, and Hadu Vane had always thought he would end the same way, useful even in defeat, his death feeding the next tide that would not fail. Captain Sorn told him the truth, and the truth was the last turn of her trick, and it was the kindest knife of all. "You will not be poured back," she said, "because you have just made it so no one can be poured back. You broke the yard's hunger. You, Hadu Vane, the marshal who kept his dead. They cannot weigh you, because you are the one who taught them that the weighing was a thing they were doing to themselves. You are safe, Marshal. You are safe in the exact way you made everyone else safe. That is what keeping the dead does. It makes the living matter. Even you. Especially you, because you are the first, and a people remembers its first." Hadu Vane sat with that for a long time. He had crossed 1100 years certain of one thing, that strength was tonnage, that the side with more hulls won, that the multitude could not lose because the multitude could not run out. And in a single afternoon over a small broken world, a captain from the rim had shown him that the multitude had been losing the whole time, losing its dead, losing its names, losing the weight that makes a people, and pouring the loss back into more loss. 40,000 years of a wound it kept reopening, because it had never learned to feel it close. The multitude had thought itself unbeatable. It had simply never met a thing that wanted to beat it by saving it. The long vanguard began to release its held hulls. This was the part the marshal had not understood would happen, and it moved him in a way he could not have predicted. The human ship did not take the held hulls as prizes. It did not keep them. One by one, gently, on the number band, it released the stopped instants back into time, and the held hulls woke, whole, their crews alive, their engines turning, returned to the moment they had been lifted out of, returned to a sky where the weighing had stopped, and the worlds below were speaking their own names. 300 breaths in each hull, let out at last, all of them alive. The long vanguard had not taken a single life. It had borrowed thousands of moments, and given every one of them back, and the giving back was the proof of the whole lesson, because a thing that wanted to win by killing would have kept them dead, and a thing that wanted to teach gave them their lives. But it did not give back the held wall of fire. That, the marshal noticed, the long vanguard kept. The 60,000 guns worth of stopped mass, the whole drunk storm of the multitude's strongest blow, stayed held in its still shell around the iron ship. Captain Sorn told him why, when he asked, and it was the gentlest correction in the whole long afternoon. "The hulls I give back," she said, "because the crews are not yours to spend. The fire I keep, because the fire was a choice, and a people should have to look at the choice it made until it understands it. When you have built a multitude that would not throw that storm, I will let it go. Until then it stays, where your tide can see it, 60,000 guns frozen in the act of arriving at one ship that meant you no harm. Look at it on the long way home, Marshal. It is the truest mirror your people have ever been given." There was a moment, in the long hours of the freeing, that Hadu Vane would carry to the end. The long vanguard, releasing its held hulls one at a time, came at last to a hull that it did not release. The marshal saw it on the deep sensors, and his breath caught. One held hull, a small one, near the front of the ring, stayed stopped while its neighbors woke around it, and the marshal thought, "Here it is. Here is the price after all. Here is the one she keeps." And then Captain Sorn spoke to him, quietly, and told him the truth of it. "This hull I cannot give back," she said, "not because I will not, because there is nothing to give back to. Your tide threw its own fire so thick, that this hull was already gone when I reached it. I did not stop a living ship. I stopped the instant of its dying, and I have held that instant for hours, because I did not want you to lose them in the noise of the battle, the way your people have always lost their dead, unmarked, unwatched, poured back before anyone could grieve. So I held the moment. I held it so you could see it. 300 crew. They were killed by the tide that came to save Tessergate, killed by your own thrown weight, and they are the only dead in this whole sky, and they are yours, and I am going to give them to you now, not to the yards, to you, so that you can do the thing your people have never done. Count them, keep them, sit with them. They are the first of your dead that will ever stay dead. Begin with them. And she released the held instant, gently, and the small hull did not wake, because there was no one left in it to wake, and it drifted dark and whole into the marshal's keeping. 300 names he did not yet have but would learn. The first kept dead of the Kortha multitude, killed by the multitude's own hand, given back by the ship that had refused to kill anyone else. The marshal looked at the dark hull for a long time. Then he gave the order, and it was a small order, and it was the largest thing he had ever done. He ordered the dark hull brought aboard the Marin Sul, not to the yards, to the throne deck, and he ordered a watch set over it, and he stood the first watch himself. The reader of this account, who is the multitude, who has 60,000 hulls and 40,000 years, is asked to sit where the marshal sat and feel what the marshal felt. The ship that came to your war zone did not break you. It did not burn your worlds. It did not pour your dead. It crossed 40 light years to a small place that called, and it stopped your tide whole, and it gave you back every life it borrowed, and the only thing it took from you was your ability to keep doing the thing you had always done. It disarmed you by making you care. And there is no shield against that, because the only way to refuse it is to go on, not caring, and once you have felt the weight, you cannot unfeel it. There was a thing the marshal noticed, standing there, that no record of the battle would ever capture, and it was the quietest thing of the whole long day. The tide had changed sound. He had commanded the multitude for 1100 years, and a tide has a sound, a low single hum on the number band, the sound of 60,000 hulls all certain of the same thing at the same time, a sound like one great animal breathing in its sleep. He had never heard the tide be anything but that. And now, listening, he heard the hum break apart into voices. 60,000 crews, each one a little different now, each one carrying its own newborn grief, each one keeping its own watch over its own dead, and the sound they made together was not the old single hum. It was a chorus. It was rough, and it was uneven, and it was full of feeling the multitude had never carried, and it was, the marshal realized, the sound a people makes, as opposed to the sound an appetite makes, and he had spent his whole life inside the appetite's hum, and had never known there was another sound until the human ship taught his tide to make it. He stood in that new sound for a while. He did not give an order. There was no order to give, because the thing that needed doing was not a thing a marshal commands. It was a thing a people does on its own, and his people were doing it, 60,000 crews keeping watch in the dark, and all the marshal could do was let them, and the letting them was itself a thing he had never done, because a tide does not let, a tide is told. He was learning, in real time, the difference between commanding a tide and leading a people, and the difference was mostly this, that a people does the right thing first, and the marshal catches up. Before he gave it, he canceled the call to the 12 holdings. The 250,000 hulls had begun to cross from the deep holdings, the largest reinforcement his people had ever raised, and the marshal sent the long band again, the band he had thought he would never need to use to say a thing like this, and he told the 12 holdings to stop, to turn around, to pour nothing, to come no further. It was the first time in 40,000 years that a marshal of the multitude had called for the full strength of his people, and then, before it arrived, told it that it was not needed, that the thing it had been summoned to crush had already taught the marshal the only lesson worth crossing the war zone for, and that the 250,000 hulls were worth more kept whole in their holdings than spent against a ship that would only fold them away and give them back. The holdings did not understand the order. There was nothing in the multitude that prepared a holding to understand it, but they obeyed, because the marshal's voice was the marshal's voice, and 200,000 hulls turned around without firing a shot, and the marshal had just saved more lives with a single cancelled order than he had ever saved with any victory. and not one of those crews would ever know how close they had come to becoming 3. Hadu Vane stood. He gave the last order of the battle, and it was an order no marshal had ever given. He ordered the tide to go home, not to regroup, not to bring more hulls, not to gather at the deep holdings and pour the yards full and come back 10 times stronger. The old answer, the only answer the multitude had ever had to a lost field. Home, to carry the kept dead back to the worlds that had grown them, and to begin the long, strange work of being a people that counts. 60,000 hulls turned away from Tesser Gate, and not one of them had been destroyed, and not one of them would be poured back, and the marshal understood that this was what victory looked like when the victor refused to kill. It looked like everyone going home. The long vanguard hung over Tesser Gate while the tide withdrew, its blue line bright, the held wall of stopped fire glittering around it like frost that would not melt. A ship that had caught the whole weight of the Kortha multitude, and was holding it up for the tide to see one last time. The worlds below it spoke their own names into the dark, over and over, the way you say a thing you were afraid you would never get to say again. 40 worlds, each one naming itself, each name a small light in a dark that had nearly swallowed it. And the human ship listened, and at last, when the tide was gone past the edge of the war zone, and only the held fire and the freed hulls and the speaking worlds remained, it answered them. The long vanguard's answer to the worlds below was 4 words, and Hadu Vane heard them from 40 light-years into his own withdrawal, because the human ship sent them on every band, the way the warning had come, so that no one in the whole war zone could fail to hear. You called, we came. That was all. The marshal had expected a banner. He had expected the human ship to name its victory, to mark the sky, to write itself across Tesser Gate, the way the multitude wrote itself across every arm it weighed. He had seen 40 arms taken, and every taking had ended the same way, with the taker's mark burned into the world's own bands, so that every child born after would know who owned the sky. The long vanguard did none of it. It said 4 words to the worlds it had saved, and then it began the long turn back toward the rim, and it asked for nothing. No tribute, no treaty, no thanks. It had crossed half a war zone to answer a call, and the answering was the whole of what it wanted, and once the call was answered, there was nothing left for it to take. Hadu Vane found that this, of everything, was the part he could not get past. He had spent 1100 years among powers that took. The multitude took worlds. The arms it weighed took revenge when they could. The few powers strong enough to stand against the tide took tribute, took borders, took promises, took the things that powers take. Every strength the marshal had ever met had been a strength that wanted something, and you could deal with a strength that wanted something. You could weigh what it wanted against what it cost. You could trade. He had traded with monsters. He had bought off horrors. He had once turned an entire predator empire aside with a single world handed over as tribute, and he had been proud of the bargain, because the bargain had cost him 1 world and saved him a war. A strength that wants something can always be paid. That was the deepest rule the marshal knew, deeper than tonnage, the rule beneath the rule. Everything in the galaxy can be paid, if you know its price. But the long vanguard wanted nothing. It had come because a small place called, and it left because the call was answered. And a power that wants nothing is a power you cannot bargain with, cannot buy, cannot turn aside, and cannot, the marshal finally understood, ever defeat, because there is no leverage against a thing that is not there to gain. He opened the private band one last time, before the distance grew too great. He did not know what he meant to say. He was a marshal of the Kortha multitude, and he had no words for the thing he felt, because his people had never kept the words. Captain Sorn answered, as if she had been waiting. "Speak, Marshal," she said. He told her the truth. He told her he did not understand how to be what she had made him. He told her that the multitude had been a tide for 40,000 years, and did not know how to be a people, that the weight she had given him was real and heavy, and he did not know how to carry it, that he had a sky full of crews who had just learned grief, and a yard full of hunger he had told to stop, and no map at all for what came next. He told her he had 400 yards that had never gone hungry, and would wake hungry tomorrow, and 60,000 hulls that had never doubted, and would wake doubting, and a whole people who had been one animal for 40,000 years, and would wake, in the morning, as 60,000 frightened crews who could die now and stay dead. He told her about the dark hull on his throne deck, the 300 he had not yet learned to grieve, and how he had stood the watch over them and not known what to do with his hands, not known what a watch was for, only that the human captain had told him to keep them, and so he had kept them, and how somewhere in the long quiet of that first watch, a thing had cracked open in him that he did not think would ever close again, and he did not know if that crack was a wound or a door, and he was afraid it was both. He told her that he had killed those 300 himself, with his own thrown fire, and that he had killed more crews than there were stars in the Warzone over 1100 years, and never once felt it. And now he felt 300, and if 300 felt like this, he did not know how he would survive feeling 40,000 years of the rest. He told her he was afraid, and he used the word the multitude had never kept, and it came out of him rough and strange like a sound a body makes for the first time. Captain Sorn was quiet. When she spoke, she did not give him a strategy. She gave him the only thing the Long Vanguard had ever given anyone. You carry it the way everyone carries it, she said. One name at a time. You will not learn it all today. You have 40,000 years of dead you never counted, and you will not count them in a season. And I will not lie to you and tell you it is easy, because it is the hardest thing your people will ever do, and it is harder than any war, because a war ends, and this does not. But you will count the ones you have, and then the ones after that, and one day, a marshal of your people will stand over a small place that calls, and that marshal will remember the weight, and that marshal will turn the tide aside before a single hull closes, and on that day you will know that the lesson took. That is how it works. We did not save Tesser Gate today, Marshal. We saved every small place your people will not weigh tomorrow, because you will remember. Carry it one name at a time. That is the whole of it. That is all any of us do. And then she said the thing that the Marshal carried longest, longer than the battle, longer than the held hulls, longer than the 4 words to the worlds below. You asked why we came so far for so small a place, she said. Here is the last of it. There is no small place. There is only the place that called, and the call that was answered, and the call that was not. Hale's Landing taught us that. 11,000 people who were small until they were gone, and then they were the largest thing in our history, because they were the thing we failed, and we built a ship so we would never fail it again. We made ourselves into the kind of people who answer. You can make yourselves into that too. You have already started. You started the moment you kept your first dead. The rest is just continuing. The band closed. The Long Vanguard crossed back over the war zone the way it had come, faster than any hull the Marshal owned, the blue line down its spine fading into the dark of the rim, past the wrecks it had not made, past the worlds it had saved, past the held wall of stopped fire it left hanging over Tesser Gate as a mirror for a people to grow into. And it did not look back, because a thing that wants nothing has no reason to look back. It went home. 40 light years to a small place called Earth, that the Marshal had once thought of as a far cold rim, and he understood now that he had it backward, that the rim was wherever the answering was not, and the center of the galaxy was wherever a call got answered. And by that measure, the Long Vanguard had been at the center of everything the whole time, and the multitude, for all its 60,000 hulls and 40,000 years, had been on the rim, alone in the cold, eating itself in the dark and calling it strength. Hadu Vane took the tide home. The story of what he did after is too long for this telling, but the shape of it is this. He opened the 400 yards to his own people, and the hunger that had fed the multitude for 40,000 years was let go, slowly, the way you let go of a thing you have held so long your hand has forgotten how to open. It did not go easily. There were marshals who fought him, marshals who wanted the old strength back, marshals who said a people that keeps its dead will be eaten by the first tide that does not. And Hadu Vane answered them with the only argument that had ever moved him, which was the held wall of fire over Tesser Gate, still hanging there, 60,000 guns frozen in the act of arriving at a ship that meant them no harm, and he made every marshal who doubted him go and look at it, and most of them came back quiet. He carried the kept dead of Tesser Gate back to the worlds that grew them, and he taught those worlds to count, and the counting spread, hull to hull, world to world, the way the eating had once spread, until the Kortha multitude was no longer a tide that ate itself, but a people that kept itself. The change took 300 years. It took longer than any war the multitude had ever fought. There were hard years in it. The multitude that kept its dead was, for a long time, a smaller thing than the multitude that ate them. The tide that had once poured every loss back into three now had to grow its hulls the slow, honest way, the way every other people in the galaxy grew them, and there were powers on the multitude's borders who had always feared the tide and now saw it shrink, and some of them came to test it. Hadu Vane met those tests, and he met them with the new strength, not the old. And the new strength surprised everyone, including him. A people that keeps its dead fights differently than a people that spends them. It fights carefully, because every loss is real now, and it fights with everything, because there is no second tide coming if this one fails. And a careful people that fights with everything, and keeps a vigil over its fallen, is a harder thing to break than any tide, because it has learned the one thing the tide never knew, which is what it is fighting for. The multitude lost no wars in those 300 years. It simply stopped starting them, and it won the ones brought to it, and the powers on its borders learned, slowly, that the small, careful thing the tide had become was more dangerous than the great, mindless thing it had been, the way a single answered call is more dangerous to a tyrant than any fleet. And Hadu Vane lived to see most of it, because a people that keeps its dead also learns to keep its old, and they kept the marshal who taught them how, the way Captain Sorn had said they would, because a people remembers its first. They built no statue to him. He forbade it. He said a people that has only just learned to keep its dead should not waste its new grief on the living. But they kept the held wall of fire over Tesser Gate, the 60,000 guns frozen in the act of arriving, and they made it a place that the young marshals were brought to before they were given their first hull, and they were made to stand under it and look up the length of the multitude's own deepest blow, ending forever at a ship that had meant them no harm, and they were told the whole story, and most of them came away from it the way the doubting marshals had come away from it 300 years before, which is to say, quiet. And once, late in his long life, a call came to the multitude, a small place on a far arm, weighed by a power the marshal had never heard of, a power that ate its dead and poured them back and had never once lost, a power that was, in every way that mattered, what the multitude had been before the long vanguard came. The call was old and weak and nearly did not carry. It came on bands too thin to reach far, from a world going quiet under a tide, the silence that the marshal had once read as breaking, and now knew was a sound, but it carried far enough, and the multitude heard it, and the multitude remembered the weight. Hadu Vane was too old to go. He sat in the deep holdings among his counted dead, and he gave the order, and the order was the one the long vanguard had taught him, without ever saying it aloud. He sent a ship, not a tide. One ship, the best his people had built in 300 years, with a kept crew, and a counted history, and a line of light down its spine that did not throw mass but caught moments. Because his people had spent 3 centuries learning to build the thing that had beaten them, not to beat anyone, but to answer. And on the hull, in 200 tongues, they wrote the name of the small place that had called, so the small place would know, the moment it saw the ship come up out of the dark, that its call had carried, that the silence had been heard, that it was not going to be too late this time. The ship crossed the war zone faster than anything the old power owned, and somewhere out near the rim, a warning bloomed on every band the old power held, spoken not by the ship, but by the galaxy's own instruments. The sound the universe makes when a new kind of strength arrives, the same sound that had once bloomed on 60,000 of Hadu Vane's own screens over Tesser Gate. The old power read the warning, and did not understand it, the way Hadu Vane had once not understood, and it tried to silence the warning and could not, the way he had tried and could not, and it turned every gun it owned toward the single ship, and felt the first cold water rise at its throat, the way he had felt it, and had no word for it, the way he had had none. And the warning said the only thing the galaxy knows how to say when the answering arrives. Warning. A war vessel has entered the war zone. It has come for the world you are weighing. It is going to take it back. The reader of this account is the old power now. The reader has more hulls than anyone has ever brought, and eats its own dead, and has never once lost. The reader is reading a warning it does not understand, watching a single ship cross the sky faster than it can follow, turning 60,000 guns toward a thing that will catch every one of them and give them back. And the reader is about to learn the lesson the multitude learned, the lesson Hale's landing bought, the lesson Hadu Vane carried one name at a time across 300 years, the lesson that travels from people to people, the way light travels, never tiring, never bending, never too late again. There is no small place, there is only the call that gets answered. And somewhere, always, a ship is already crossing the war zone to answer it.